Okay, now that we've talked about what's the most likely way there'd be a 269 tie in the electoral college between Trump and Biden, let's now talk about what actually would happen if this were to occur, if there was a tie in the electoral college. And as I said at the start of the video, the House of Representatives would independently choose the president, and the Senate would independently choose the vice president. But here's the catch. In the House of Representatives, it's not that each member votes independently for the president. It's kind of weird because instead, each state as a whole votes as an entire state for the president. So instead of there being 435 different votes for either candidate, there's only 50. And that's really weird because Alaska, who only has one representative, would have the same amount of power as, let's say, California, who has over 50. And a lot of people say that's not fair because you have smaller states unfairly getting more power. But that makes everything a lot more tricky because the thing is that the House of Representatives that chooses the president, it's not the current one, the one that's there in 2020. It's the one that newly gets elected during this election in the fall, in November. The newly elected Congress is what actually votes for the president if there's a tie. So whoever becomes president in this scenario, it's all dependent on what happens in the Congress elections in the fall. So that's what makes this really hard to predict. It's not really possible to predict at this moment, honestly, but if I were to make a prediction, an estimate, I would say Republicans have a slight advantage over Democrats. Now, I say this because even though Democrats have a majority, Republicans still have a majority of states controlled. Because in general, the system of having smaller states getting more representation helps Republicans a bit more. What this means is that Republicans have slightly more power and they're a bit more likely to be able to win the election. And if you look at each state's congressman, you'll see that Republicans control, I think it's 26 states as of now. So Republicans have a slight edge in that aspect, but the thing is that it's basically impossible to know for sure what's going to happen with any sort of likelihood, what's going to happen at this moment until the elections actually happen. Once the elections happen, we can talk about what would happen, but anyway, it's not even likely that there'll be a tie, so by the time the election actually happens, it won't even matter. But this is all for speculation, it's all for fun, so I don't know. But since it's hard and basically impossible to figure out who would be president, what I think is slightly easier to figure out is who would be vice president, because that is left up to the Senate, and unlike the House of Representatives, each member gets a vote rather than each state getting a vote. So this is also dependent on how the Senate elections, how the fall elections go, but it's easier to predict what things are going to be like for the Senate than for the House of Representatives. The reason being is that not all senators are up for election, and even then, you have easier predictions. You have less contests, less territories. Instead of different districts, you just have different states. It's a lot easier to map out, a lot easier to predict. But that's what I'm going to be doing right now, actually. We're going to be talking about what the Senate elections are going to be like, because that'll help us figure out who's going to be vice president. Because if we can't figure out who's going to be president, we at least want to know who would be vice president. Are we going to be stuck with Pence, or are we going to be stuck with whoever Biden chooses, which is not known at this moment. But we're going to get into that right now, in fact. So, the Senate elections are going to go largely the same way as the actual election, but there's a few differences that we'll talk about. First, let's start with Oregon. That's almost certainly going to go for Democrats, and New Hampshire, even though in the presidential election it generally is a swing state, in the Senate elections it definitely leans Democrat. There's definitely a left lean. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, all going to be Democrats in all likelihood. Republicans, Idaho, Wyoming, those are both going to be most likely Democrats. South Dakota, Nebraska. Iowa, I think, is going to be most likely go for Democrats. Not Democrats, Republicans. Illinois, I think, is going to go for Democrats. Despite being swing states, Minnesota and Michigan both are likely going to have Democratic wins in the Senate. And the reason is because Senate elections work a bit differently than normal presidential elections. So that kind of changes things up a bit. And West Virginia is going to be Republican win in all likelihood. Kentucky, the thing about Kentucky is that it's almost certainly going to be a Republican win, but so many people hate Mitch McConnell that just might make it a bit easier for Democrats to win, but even then, it's gonna be a Republican win. Likely, Mitch McConnell's getting 6 more years, whether you like it or not. Kansas, Oklahoma, both gonna be Republican wins. And Texas, like I said, has been trending Democratic. Beto O'Rourke almost became senator as a Democrat 2 years ago. But even then, I still think John Cornyn's going to stay the senator of Texas, so I'll put that as likely. And Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, all definitely lean towards Republicans. All will have a Republican senator. Tennessee, South Carolina also. Alabama is a pretty interesting one. Right now we have a Democrat senator, Doug Jones, but that's only because the special election where the Republican candidate was especially bad, Roy Moore. So Doug Jones was able to pull off a win there, but I don't think he'll be able to pull that win off again. So I think Alabama will likely be, or at least lean towards Republicans. So Republicans at 46, Democrats at 44. This is where it gets a bit trickier. Colorado, even though right now it's a Republican senator, Colorado definitely leans towards the Democrats. I think John Hickenlooper will likely win this Senate seat over Cory Gardner. New Mexico is also going to be Democratic win likely. And I think the current incumbent there's a Democrat, so I think it'll stay Democrat, even though the senator's retiring, I think. Arizona is a swing state, like I said, but in the 2018 election, it was a Democrat win, so I think it might be the same in 2020, so I'll just put that as a lean Democrat for now. Alaska is gonna likely be Republican win. I think that's a pretty safe bet. Virginia is gonna be almost certainly a Democrat win. Put that as Democrats. North Carolina is a swing state, sort of. In the presidential election, it leans towards Republicans, but I think in the Senate election, Democrats have a slight advantage, at least based on the polling numbers, but I don't know, that's subject to change. And Georgia, I think both senators are going to stay Republicans. I think Georgia is sort of trending towards Democrats, trending towards the left, but I still think it's going to stay in Republicans' column. But now we have a 49-49 tie right now, and there's 2 states left. Maine and Montana. Maine, I think Democrats have a slight advantage over Susan Collins, but that might change. And Maine is a swing state also in the presidential election, so it might be the same for the Senate election. But I think Democrats have a slight lead there. Now, Montana is a really interesting scenario, because in general it leads pretty heavily towards the right, towards Republicans, but this specific Senate election might actually be a competitive match because the Democratic challenger, Steve Bullock, against the Republican incumbent, Dean Daines. Steve Bullock is actually doing pretty well, apparently. I think his presidential run, because he ran for president, he did pretty badly there, but I think that gained him some name recognition for the Senate run, so that, I think, he has a slight chance of winning, but even then, I think it leans towards Republicans. But the thing is that you see here, it's interesting, because the Senate election, as I mapped it out, is a 50-50 tie also. So what happens here is that the Senate has to keep voting it out until they come up with they finally decide on who's the vice president. But based on what all I've mapped out here, I think that it's still more likely to go for Republicans. Why do I say that? Because Democrats only have 46 seats right now, or 47 seats right now. Republicans have 53. Republicans, they can afford more losses than Democrats, because Democrats have to win North Carolina and Colorado and Maine and Arizona. That's a lot on the line. I think Republicans have a bit of a safer match here, so I think that Republicans have a slightly better chance of maintaining a Senate majority, and as a result, keeping Mike Pence as the vice president. Like I said, the presidential election in the House of Representatives way too hard to predict right now, but at least we were able to come up with a rough estimation for the vice president. Like I said, more likely than not, it would be Mike Pence in this scenario. But I think that is it for the video. It's a quite long video, there's a lot to talk about here, but like I said, if there's a 269-269 tie, I showed the map, this would be the map, and the House of Representatives, too hard to predict, slight Republican lean, slight advantage for Trump, and the Senate, slight advantage for Mike Pence, Republicans. So, even in a tie, Republicans still have a slight advantage, but I don't think a tie is going to happen. I'm going to be honest, those are really unlikely. It's not impossible, but I don't think it's going to happen. A lot of people are saying Biden has a big advantage in this election. I don't know if that's true or not. We just have to wait and see. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you consider liking the video, subscribing to the video, and sticking around for future videos that I may upload on this channel. This channel is new. I hope I can continue to have the channel grow, but I also hope you stick around for future videos. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.